She laid her hand on me, and this she did say, I'll not be long, love, till our wedding day.
Long ago, when my great-grandmother was young and the world was quite a different place, in the little village of Brunimor, there was a cottage that looked far out to sea, over the rolling waves of Bay or Forlai, the Bay of Seals. And there lived a widow with her daughter, Gwylan. The girl was not pretty, but she was bright and cheerful and kind. She was not graceful when she walked, but when she ventured into the chill waters of the bay, it was a sight to see as she dived and swam, the sun glistening on her sleek, dark hair as she bobbed among the waves. Each day, when her work was done, Gwylan would take down her simple harp, which was strung on a driftwood frame, and play. And when she sang, it was so beautiful that the seals in the bay would pause in their play to listen. Gwylan grew into a fine young woman. One night, when the moon was full and the tide was high, and her mother was long since away to her bed in the little loft, she took down her harp and sang, wistfully, a song of longing and of loving. Her voice rose and fell like the waves, and the notes of the harp tumbled from her fingers, flowing through the open door, across the little garden, over the cliff and down to the sea. From the bay she heard the bark of a bull seal, and then she thought she heard a voice singing softly in reply, in a lilting tongue, the sound wafting to her ears on the night breeze. And then it was gone. Gwylan hung her harp back on the wall and, sighing, carried the lamp into her little room, where she turned back the quilt with the stitched waves and the seagulls after which she was named, turned back the linen sheet, and lay down to sleep. In the distance, as she fell into her dream, she heard the bark of the bull seal again. She dreamed of a young man come to love her in the night. As he slipped in, naked as a seal, beside her, she smelled the scent of the kelp and felt his skin slick and salty against hers. Gwylan, van Chariad, my darling, he whispered, and his voice was soft as the little waves that ran up the beach, leaving shells and pebbles as they ran back, laughing. Mi Cariad, love me, she sighed. And they rocked together like a boat on the swell. He held her in his arms until the sky began to pale, then he slipped away as the tide turned and ebbed, and she woke to hear the barking of a bull seal out in the bay. Then she fell back into a dreamless sleep until the sun crept over her windowsill. Gwylan woke and stretched lazily, hearing the kittiwakes call as they wheeled overhead. She pulled back the wave and seagull quilt and the linen sheet, and found there was sand in the bed, and a little sprig of kelp upon the pillow. She smiled as she went out to the garden and down to the stream in her shift and bathed, washing the night from her hair and her skin. The days and weeks passed in hard work and simple pleasures, and the moon waned and then waxed again. When it was full once more, at midnight, when the tide was high, Gwylan took down her harp and played and sang. Her voice rose and fell like the waves, and the notes of the harp tumbled from her fingers, flowing through the open door, across the little garden, over the cliff and down to the sea. Again, from the bay, she heard the bark of a bull seal, and then the voice singing softly in reply. Gwylan hung her harp on the wall and carried the lamp into her little room, where she turned back the quilt with the stitched waves and the seagulls, turned back the linen sheet and lay down to sleep. She dreamed of the young man again, come to love her in the night. As he slipped in, naked as a seal, beside her, she smelled the scent of the kelp and felt his skin slick and salty against hers. Gwylan, van Chariad, my darling, he whispered, and his voice was as soft as the manes of the white horses that topped the waves in the bay. Cariad, love me, she sighed, and they rocked together like a boat on the swell. He held her in his arms until the sky began to pale, then he slipped away as the tide turned and ebbed, and she woke to hear the barking of a bull seal out in the bay. Then she fell back into a dreamless sleep until the sun crept over her windowsill. The moon waned and waxed, and each full moon, Gwilym dreamed of her sleek and salty lover. She began to grow round and, not knowing what to do, said nothing to her mother. As time went by, however, she could hide her swelling belly no longer, and her mother asked who the father of this child was, who must marry her and save her from shame. "Mother," she replied, "there's been no one, only the dream of a young man, slick and salty, who comes in the night and leaves with the ebbing tide." "Oh, Gwilym, what kind of story is that? You can't bring a baby into this house with no father. Your life will be ruined. You must go to your grandmother until the child is born, and then we must wrap it up and leave it on the steps of the church for someone to find." Gwilym ran from the house, down the path to the shore of the bay, and waded into the water. "Oh, cariad breuddwyd, my dream lover, what am I to do?" And she cried 7 tears into the face of the moon reflected in the ripples. At that moment she heard a bull seal bark close at hand and saw a dark head bobbing in the water. Then it was gone. She scanned the surface of the bay, but all was calm. A cloud scudded over the moon and turned the world to silver grey. When it had passed, she heard a slipping sound in the shingle behind her and started. "No, don't turn now, Gwilym," said a voice. Then there was another sound, like that of a cloak falling to the ground, and his arms were around her. "Your 7 tears have called me from the waves, Fy Chariad, and here I am." They lay in the dunes, and he kissed away her tears as they rocked together like a boat on the swell. Then Gwilym told him what her mother had said, how she must go away to her grandmother, and when the child was born, wrap him up and leave him on the steps of the church. He took her hand in his and said, "I am Telor Ailton, singer of the wave of the line of Dylan Ailton, son of Arianrod. Our child is of a noble line, and he must come with me and live in the court of the Selkies, for he too will be such. When he's born, you must hold him up at the window so I can see him from the bay. I can't leave the sea again until high tide or the first full moon after his birth, but then I'll come for him. Oh, I only wish I could take you too." And Gwilym cried again, to think that she must lose her newborn son regardless, that he would be taken to live with the Selkies, to swim in the waves and the foam while she stayed on the land. The sky began to pale, the tide turned and ebbed, and her lover left her among the pink sea thrift and the blue sea holly. Gwilym climbed back up the beach to pack her things and set off for her grandmother's cottage. When she got there, her grandmother saw at once why she had come. She asked the same question as her mother, but more gently. And when Gwilym told of her dream lover, salty and slick, her grandmother smiled and put her arms around her. "Ah, paidiwch a pwni, don't worry, child," she said. "You can stay here till the baby is born. I will go and see what we have for you and for him in your great-grandmother's chest, for I have a tale to tell you." Gwilym's time soon came, and one night she bore a fine bonny boy with brown hair and eyes as black as midnight. Her grandmother took him in her arms and, crossing to the window, held him up to the moonlight. From out in the bay, they heard the bark of a bull seal and smiled. The days passed, and Gwilym nursed her little son as she waited and thought of his father, strong and salty and slick, out in the foam. The moon waxed, and when it was full, she took her harp from the wall and she played and sang. Her voice rose and fell like the waves, and the notes of the harp tumbled from her fingers, flowing through the open door, across the little garden, over the cliff, and down to the sea. From the bay she heard the bark of a bull seal, and then a voice softly singing in reply, in a lilting tongue, the sound wafting to her ears on the night breeze. And she waited. It wasn't long before her door opened, and then there was Telor Ailton, come to fetch his son. Gwilym sat in the nursing chair with little Morcant on her knee, a fine golden chain about his neck. Telor knelt before Gwilym, tears in his eyes, tears of joy at seeing his newborn son, and tears of sadness at the thought of taking him from his loving mother. Then he looked up at Gwilym. She was naked, but for a seal pelt. Her Selkie great-grandmother's seal pelt kept in the trunk all those long years since she slipped out of it and left the sea to marry Gwilym's great-grandfather and live on the land. Gwilym stood and took her harp from the wall, and Telor took his wife and his son, and they padded softly out of the little cottage, through the little garden and down the sloping hill path to the bay. The moon was shining on the ripples at the edge of the water as they stepped barefoot into the sea, and with a splash, Telor, his wife Gwilym, and their son Morcant ap Telor headed out into the bay. From the window of the little cottage high above, Gwilym's grandmother watched until the last glint and twinkle of the little gold chain around the baby seal's neck disappeared, and they were gone. Thereafter, at every full moon when the tide was high, at midnight, you could hear the faint sound of a harp and voices raised in song, far out in what came to be known as Bahi Can y Morloi, Seal Song Bay.